talk about constraints, right? There are three types of constraints. There are three categories of constraints which you might want to know. Number one is called as flexible constraints. Another is called flexible or the semi-flexible or the partially flexible constraints. And the third one is inflexible constraints. What I mean by flexible constraints, which means these constraints does not have any dates associated with it. For example, as soon as possible and as late as possible. We all know in a forward scheduling, all activities are scheduled as soon as possible. In a backward, all activities are scheduled as late as possible. So now let me go back to my project. So I'm just undoing the last change what I've made. So I'm going to open the first activity T1 here. So you can find on the advanced tab of that particular task, there is a small drop-down available called constraint type. Please note in this project plan I have done a forward scheduling. So all activities are scheduled as soon as possible. But if you can see the drop-down, there are other types available like as late as possible and the other 6 constraints. So when you go for a forward scheduling, the constraint type will be as soon as possible, which means the moment the predecessor completes, the current activity will start as soon as possible, which means this task will be scheduled. The start date and finish date you see here will be as per your early start and your early finish. But when I say this activity should be scheduled as late as possible, naturally that activity will be scheduled using the late start and the late finish. Okay. Going back to the slides, the second type is called as partially flexible. What I mean by partially flexible, which means these activities have some kind of a partial constraint that it cannot start before a particular date, but any date after that is fine. Or it needs to finish not before a particular date, okay, but after any date is fine. So you can find that these types of constraints are of 4 types. It can be start no earlier, start no later, finish no earlier, or finish no later than constraints. So when you want to restrict an activity to start or finish not before or not after a particular date, you can go for the semi-flexible constraints. The last one is called as inflexible. It's more like a do or a die date, which means these activities should start or should finish by a given date. So an example of those constraints are must finish on and must start on. Okay. So this is a point which I've already highlighted.